So I wanted to do a video on Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance because it's a great example of getting lost in abstract worlds. And it's based on a book that I've been working on. It should be out sometime next year. And the premise is that human beings were like all the other creatures on the planet. We were conscious throughout our days. And conscious experiences defined reality. And humans did something very tricky at some point. Maybe it was 10,000 years ago, maybe 50, but we created language, this map of the territory, these sounds that could represent conscious experiences. And that in itself didn't really cause any problems. But then we took another step up this abstraction ladder, and then another. And soon we were completely cut off from the real world, living in these abstractions that never pointed back down to reality any longer. And that's what the world is that we're living in now. We're not living in the real world. We're living in these abstract worlds that are disconnected from the joy and mystery and peace and calmness that you find when you're in the real world. I mean, why else do people meditate and practice mindfulness? These practices are being in reality rather than thinking about it. In other words, when you practice mindfulness, when you practice meditation, you're coming out of the abstract world and you're grounding yourself back in conscious experiences. How else should we define reality but conscious experiences? And you can believe in other realities, but you have to believe in them. Anything beyond conscious experiences requires a belief. And now that we're so disconnected from the real world, these abstract realities get confused for the real world. And we throw these abstractions around like ownership, government, tolerance, intolerance, and we throw them around as if they're as grounded in reality as these simple words like sun or metaphor. We say Juliet is the sun, and it's a metaphor because it's an abstract idea like Juliet's appearance, Juliet's personality, but we've grounded it in a conscious experience, the warmth and beauty of the sun. And we do the same thing in science. So you can't just use words in science. They require special definitions. So it reminds me back in grad school, where the story about this intelligence researcher was going around where he was defining intelligence by using other abstract concepts like how clever you are, how creative you are. And people were very upset with this because they're like, well, I don't know what you mean by creativity. I don't know what you mean by how smart you are. In the end, he was forced to define it in a way that came back to the real world. He had to ground it in conscious experiences, something everyone could see. And in the end, he said, intelligence is your score on my test, which is exactly what it is. It couldn't be anything else. And so in this case, he was forced to take an abstract idea and bring it back down. And of course, in science, they call that operational definitions. In science, you can't deal in the abstract world because it doesn't get you anywhere. That, in a lot of ways, if you watch this channel, you know I love philosophy, but so much of philosophy is lost in that abstract world without ever coming back down to something that we can consciously experience for ourselves, which means it's lost reality altogether. And so one of the reasons science has progressed so much further than philosophy, and philosophy itself, like I mentioned in the last video, has finally recognized the importance of conscious observation. And so anyway, when it comes to the paradox of tolerance, the idea is it's a wonderful paradox. It feels like it means something. You say, well, society can't be totally tolerant of everything, including intolerance, because if it is, eventually intolerance will win and tolerance will lose. So even a tolerant society must be intolerant of intolerance. And so that's the paradox. And when I said that, maybe it felt like it meant something. That's the seductive qualities of the abstract world. They feel like they're coming back down to the real world, but they only seem like that. That's the illusory part of abstractions. And so Popper, which is ironic that he would be the one to come up with this, because he's also the person who came up with falsification, which requires conscious observation. And that is a huge part of science now. So the idea of falsification is you can't prove a hypothesis. So I may say, well, all Ferraris are green. Now let's imagine I gather up every Ferrari possible and they're all green, but I still haven't proven the hypothesis, because there could be a red Ferrari on Mars. So it's much easier to disprove a hypothesis. So if I say, well, all Ferraris are green, then I just show one red Ferrari, I've disproven the hypothesis. And science has picked up on that. But again, the point is it requires conscious observation. And so that's the weakness of this paradox of tolerance. What one person thinks tolerance is, another person may disagree with, because we're all just making it up. There's no foundation in reality. These terms haven't been defined. And so I've seen people use these terms just to, cancel out someone they just didn't like. And they said, well, that person's intolerant. We can't tolerate their intolerance, so we need to give them the boot. And I've seen that several times. And so, again, it could be used for exactly what the opposite of its intention. Instead of using it for tolerance, it actually ironically gets used to strengthen intolerance, even against people who may be quite tolerant, ironically, because it all depends on how we connect it back down to genuine conscious experience.